Good evening. My name is Megan Provost. I am Vice President of Policy and Programs at Farm Foundation. Thank you all for joining us for this evening's symposium, co-hosted by the Farm Foundation's Food and Agricultural Trade Resource Center and the Clayton Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. We are so excited about this evening's program and the opportunity to partner with the ITER Institute in what we hope is the first of many collaborations. So you've already heard this evening how the U.S. food and agricultural sector has seen firsthand over the last few months what happens when uncertainty is introduced into trade policy. We've seen an immediate and significantly negative impact on agricultural trade, whether it's lower prices at the farm gate, reduced farm income, tighter credit markets, fewer input and equipment purchases. Reduced agricultural exports can have a ripple effect on the farm economy, on rural communities, and on the U.S. economy as a whole. Since 1933, Farm Foundation has served agriculture and rural communities as a catalyst for sound public policy, providing objective information to foster a deeper understanding of issues shaping the future. We do not lobby or advocate. Our 86-year history of objectivity allows us to bring together diverse groups for meaningful discussions. Our Food and Agricultural Trade Resource Center is one such opportunity. Farm Foundation's new research center is designed to bring clarity to trade discussions and enable productive debate and dialogue on trade policy issues. The initiative includes a series of 3 components: a series of white papers addressing a variety of agricultural trade topics, objective, concise issue papers from the Trade Resource Center, our educational tools on the basics of agricultural trade, and more in-depth papers that explore the food and agricultural sector's relationship for global trade. Dialogue opportunities are the second leg of this stool, including symposiums like you're at today, webinars, and podcasts. And the third component, an electronic trade information hub to serve as a central location for timely information on the latest trade issues. If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to check out our website, farmfoundation.org/trade, for access to all of these resources. Proposed tariffs, sanctions, and other trade barriers could significantly alter long-term trading relationships and introduce struggling farmers and agribusinesses into a new area of unpredictability. Understanding the reasoning behind, the meaning of, and the potential impacts of trade policy decisions is critical to the future success of the U.S. food and agriculture sector. Our stakeholders need to take advantage of the opportunity to educate themselves and to join the conversation about trade policy, and their implications. With this evening's panel, we're going to do just that. So joining me on stage for our panel discussion are Dr. John Beghin, who is the brand new Michael Yanney Chair of International Trade and Finance at the Clayton Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance and the Department of Agricultural Economics here at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. Today is officially John's second day on the job, so we're happy to have him here with us tonight, and please go easy on him. Also joining me on stage is Ambassador Richard Crowder. He's the professor and Thornhill Endowed Chair in Agricultural Trade in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Virginia Tech University. He is a former chief agricultural negotiator for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative and a member of the Farm Foundation Board of Directors. And also joining me on stage, Ambassador Darci Vetter, who is Vice Chair of Agriculture, Food, and Trade at Edelman, a global communications and marketing firm. Darci is also a former chief agricultural negotiator for the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep and also a member of the Farm Foundation Board of Directors. So I'm going to turn it over to each of them to share a few remarks with you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience for the panel. So we're going to kick it off with John.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me and taking a chance with the new professor. I hope I won't say anything too crazy. So I'm going to step back a little bit from the ag in a few remarks and just give us a reminder that trade is a two-way street where, of course, we all know that exports are good on the income side because we sell and increase our farm income and other income. But imports are also good. I enjoy cheap mangoes at the grocery store, and they're not grown in the U.S. And the same, my wife enjoy Ethiopian coffee coming also at a low price in the US. So, in terms of consumer choice and consumer cost, trade is also good on the import side, benefiting society. Of course, there are winners and losers, and the economic profession hasn't been very good at thinking of how to compensate the losers, who tend to be, of course, with a strong voice and organized. And if anything, the economic profession should explicitly design a more compelling mechanism to compensate losers in those trade integration scenarios. Creating jobs with protection, like is currently done and has been done before. I mean, many things that actually the Trump administration has been doing is not really nothing new. And so the cost is very high. For instance, there was a recent study at University of Chicago and by the Fed of Chicago looking at the cost of the import of a washing machine, and the cost is about $800,000 plus per job created for a job that's really not with high pay, around $40,000 to $50,000. And so many studies have been done along those lines by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and on average, creating job by closing markets or imposing trade barriers cost about $500,000 per job. And so there is plenty of room there to design a mechanism to compensate losers when trade opening takes place or trade integration takes place. Another point to be reminded of is that technology is often the culprit for job destruction in some mature industries rather than trade. And trade takes a bad rap for being the alleged driver of job loss when technology is. For instance, think of Uber and the taxi service industry, which is essentially a non-traded service, and job destruction and business destruction by Uber in the traditional taxi market has been phenomenal and very tragic in many cities. Yet there is no trade, and that's 100% of technology, and I would say basically revolution in the information system used to coordinate buyers and sellers for taxi services. A few other points to note is that there is issues of style and methods, and so the methods used by the Trump administration have nothing new. So if you look at Section 301, 201, and then Section 232 of the older Trade Expansion Act of 1964. All those policies have been used way before Trump came to the White House. And so, for instance, the Reagan administration didn't tweet, but was a very heavy user of Section 301 and to open markets and use aggressive unilateralism. So, of course, Reagan didn't tweet, but the policies were being used, and the clubbing or the threat of clubbing with a heavy baseball bat have been there for a long time. The benefits of trade war also are, pretty uncertain and exposed. We can now look at, for instance, NAFTA 2. It hasn't been put in place yet, or not even ratified. But several economists have looked at the cost and benefits of this new NAFTA 2. And the gains are very limited. For ag export, it's mostly $450 million of expanded exports to Canada, not towards Mexico. So one can really wonder why we want to hit Mexico with a 5% tariff on all exports coming out of Mexico to the U.S. And and the net gains in income are 200 million or less for the U.S. So this really protracted negotiation of a new NAFTA have achieved, of course, some benefits in terms of intellectual property rights and a few other things, but they were highly disruptive, and by the end of the day, the gains have been quite limited. And the downfall potential, I think, has been very high. So that's also something to note. I think getting out of the TPP, as noted by Luke, is also really a missed opportunity. For ag, especially, it was quite important. The same with TTIP. Resetting TTIP, I think, was also a big mistake. Those two agreements potentially can increase US GDP by about 0.5% each. And so you think of income generation and demand for ag and food even just in the U.S. in general to increase economic activity. So not thinking even of the geopolitics, getting out of those, or at least resetting those two important negotiations with really key partners has been quite a big mistake, I think. I think I'll stop here and let my co-panelists make their own remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, John. It's indeed an honor for me to be here tonight, particularly at the ITER Institute, because I'm one of those good people that had a chance to work with Clayton Yeutter. I worked for him when he was Secretary of Agriculture at USDA. I used him as a mentor when I was Chief Ag Negotiator at USTR, and we served on the same corporate board for a while, so it's a pleasure to be here. I would say that when it came to trade, no one brought more ideas, passion, energy, or results to the table than Clayton. I mean, Clayton was the person, and the discussions that we're having here today is but another reflection of Clayton's vision. So, Christy, it's good to have you here, and I appreciate the time I had with Clayton. Now, these discussions are timely. I'll try to get to them pretty quickly so we have time for questions. Because we are in a trade war with China, and agriculture is bearing a disproportionate share of it. I mean, like it or not, just what the facts are, the rules changed from the old days when agriculture was soybeans were traded for citrus in negotiations rather than soybeans traded for washing machines or whatever it might be. And the uncertainty surrounding trade and trade policy is the greatest I've seen since the Euro around. We were thinking about tarification and where that was going. Now, since we are going to be short, I want to give you a couple of takeaway points. The China priority is correct. As a person who sold seed there with intellectual property and could only own 49% of your business, as a trade negotiator there and as head of an association there, I can tell you we have issues with China in terms of the business operations and so forth. So that's correct. But, that having been said, not enough attention is paid to what I call non-tariff, non-China issues, such as free trade agreements, SPF agreements, and this type of thing. The lack of any new free trade agreements, to me, is a self-inflicted wound with long-term consequences. It soon will be, well, in another two years, it will have been 10 years since we had a free trade agreement enter into force. And we'll talk a little bit more about the competition in that. Now, I think that you don't see headlines that say 10 years and no free trade agreements, 10 years and EU has 7 free trade agreements entered into force, this type of thing. But I think as we think about, we'll look at tomorrow, Trump can take the tariffs off, he and she can make a deal and take the tariffs off. But Luke, I really like yours overlap with mine because Luke talked to us about increasing competition on a commercial basis around the world. I'm talking about policies that affect that competitive position in the world, and tariffs and trade and this type of thing. So, and we need complementary or substituting effects rather than compounding effects. We don't need to do anything else. And in falling behind in tariff scales reduction is very difficult to overcome. I said in 2009 in a conversation that we needed a relentless pursuit of free trade agreements to keep us competitive. And I was optimistic when the current administration came in and said, we're going to focus on bilaterals and not so much on the World Trade Organization and this type of thing. So what have we had in bilaterals? We withdrew from TPP, it wasn't exactly a bilateral, but the only thing we've done is say withdraw from TPP and and we don't have any new bilaterals at all in that time. Compare that with Europe. 7 bilateral free trade agreements entered into force since Panama, which was our last one, entered into force. They've got 12 notified to the WTO that they're going to negotiate. We've got 1. That one is with the EU. Think about what the prospects for that are right now. Not too great. In the U.S., this is an interesting point, I think. We have 7 priority markets in Asia at USDA. And by the way, the team we have at USDA, I think, does a great job for us in the environment they're in. But anyway, we have 7 priority Asian markets. Each of those Asian markets has a free trade agreement with one or more of our competitors. We don't have a free trade agreement with any of them. Canada. At the workshop in Washington recently, one of the Canadians told me, and may have said it in his speech, we're just picking up the spoils. We like the EU agreement we have with, we like the trade agreement we've got with Japan through the TPP, and we like Vietnam. We wonder how long you can let us do it. Anyway, but I think we've reached a point of urgency. It takes some time to get a free trade agreement entered into force. Peru, Panama, Korea, Colombia averaged 55 months from signing to enter into force. So it could be some time before we have another one. The short-term hurt in agriculture right now is excruciating, to say the least. And some people will give you the figure the benefit of free trade agreements. It's also a cost of not having them. We've done some work at Virginia Tech recently that says if we don't change our position with Japan, in the next 10 years we're going to lose $3 billion in exports sales of beef and pork alone. Those two alone. So it's time and our competitive activity. Bottom line, we're losing market share, we're losing profits, not only because of China, but because of our competitive position in it. And our position will continue to deteriorate if we do not act properly, and we need offsetting actions rather than compounding actions. Thank you, and I'll take some questions later.
So now my turn here, last but not least, I hope. First of all, just want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here on this panel this evening for many reasons. First of all, because Nebraska is my home state and it's always good to be home. Second, because I have had the opportunity to work in trying to get the ball rolling with the ITER Institute, but also was one of many people who was fortunate to call Clayton Yeutter a mentor and a friend. I did not get to know Clayton until after his career in government service was over, but he was a generous giver of advice and an important cheerleader when needed during my government career. I remember in particular an email he sent during the negotiation of the TPP Ag package where he reminded me that if everyone's yelling at you, you're probably doing something right. And I appreciated that very much, and I think he knew from experience. I'm also sharing the stage with another one of my mentors, Dick Crowder, who I was a member of his team at USTR when he was the chief agriculture negotiator, and it was a huge honor then to be able to assume that position years later, knowing I had had such big shoes to fill, so this is great fun. When Dick spoke a moment ago, he talked mostly about the importance of free trade agreements and what it means that we are really falling behind in terms of having an offensive agenda in forming new agreements. But I want to focus on what I think is a critical problem of really the failure for the United States to show leadership in forming global trade policy, and the fact that we have quite deliberately stepped back from leading in that arena and what that might mean. The United States not only used to be more aggressively negotiating new free trade agreements with other countries, but we were continually creating new benchmarks with every agreement that we negotiated. We set new trade policy, and what happens when a country negotiates a new agreement is that that agreement becomes the standard that is then emulated by other countries when they form agreements with each other, and becomes the baseline for every agreement that comes after, whether or not the United States is a party to it. The very first agreement I had the opportunity to help negotiate was the US-Chile Free Trade Agreement in 2001. I think we finally finished it in 2003, and that was in the Bush administration. And that was the first agreement where we had fully enforceable labor and environmental provisions in a trade agreement. Those are now used widely by countries around the globe. They help to set a level playing field and ensure that all countries have certain labor and environment standards in place and don't just do a race to the bottom in order to reduce the costs of goods that are traded. The United States has continually added to those measures in trade agreements, continuing to raise the bar. We have continually set new levels of ambition in our trade agreements, and by that I mean the number of products covered and the extent to which tariffs and non-tariff barriers for those products are phased out. So more comprehensive in terms of product coverage and deeper cuts in the trade barriers between countries. The United States consistently used to require strong rules on transparency and the ability for the public to participate in rulemaking around trade, something we might take for granted in our governments, but becomes a major barrier for US companies trying to do business overseas if they don't have an opportunity to provide public comment in rulemaking, to know what rules will be implemented before they come into force and we suddenly have to make adjustments at the border. Digital trade. You know, the TPP would have been one of the first agreements, well, is actually, because the other countries went ahead without us, created real rules about digital trade flows and the movement of data across borders. And we know how much of our trade and in both goods and services now have to do with the movement of data. TPP contains the first ever commitments, again, led by the United States in negotiating them on disciplining state-owned enterprises. We negotiated that with the idea that someday China would join that agreement, and we wanted to be able to discipline the behavior of their state-owned companies. And the United States has continually set a higher and higher bar on intellectual property protection in our trade agreements. We are an innovation-led economy, and we want to protect that innovation overseas. So if the United States does not have an offensive agenda, if we do not view trade as a key part of both our economic and our political diplomacy with others, we're failing to set those benchmarks that over time we've continued to set higher and higher, not just giving us another export opportunity for our goods, but I always used to say with the TPP that more important than the corn or the soybeans or the beef we were selling, we were exporting our way of doing business. Transparency, sanctity of contracts, plain, clear dealing with one another, science-based decision-making on things like SPS, and those things are important. And you know, Dick also commented that he believes the focus on China and our attempt to hold China to account is right. And I don't disagree that we need to discipline China's behavior. But I think we could be using our negotiations with China, this spotlight we're putting on China's behavior, as another opportunity to lead and to bring our allies with us. And instead, we've chosen to pick a bilateral fight with a huge economy that now has an opportunity to play us off against others who are our allies and who are equally frustrated with China's behavior. And so while the US and China talk about reforming China in a bilateral fashion, Europe, Japan, Brazil, others who would like to join us are not. And any agreements that are reached between the US and China on a reform may not apply to our allies who could benefit from them as well. So again, I think the spotlight may be correct. I think the tactics are too narrow and too transactional, and we could be doing more. And I don't want to forget the WTO. We're here with the ITER Institute. Clayton Yeutter, of course, was one of the the people who really formed the foundation of today's rules-based trading system and helping to create the World Trade Organization. And this administration, again, has created a spotlight that can be healthy on the fact that we have some tensions in Geneva about how the WTO operates. It's true that we have hit a point where developing countries have such an influence on the global economy, they need to take on more of their share of the commitments in Geneva, just like developed countries do. And it is true that the dispute settlement body, which settles trade litigation among countries when there are disputes at the WTO, has sometimes overreached in its rulings. But instead of this administration has pointed out those tensions, but instead of engaging as a way to solve them, it has used them as an excuse to retreat. And those institutions which were built with US leadership may not survive if the United States chooses not to participate. And I don't think we should forget how much we use them every single day. Luke pointed out for us that between 50 and 60% of our trade, I'm not counting China here because we don't have a bilateral free trade agreement with them, are with countries with whom the US has a free trade agreement. But that means half of our trade is not. And it's with dozens of other countries who have significant size trade with us, and that the US ag economy would suffer greatly if we couldn't get into those markets. But we don't have the bandwidth, even with the amazing team that we have in USDA's Foreign Ag Service and at USTR and the dedicated civil servants we have around the globe, could not possibly play whack-a-mole to try to go to each one of those countries and to discipline their policies, to make sure their tariffs stayed in line with where we had agreed. Even negotiating bilateral agreements with each of them would take decades and decades to do. We rely on the rules-based international trading system and the commitments that each of those countries have made to the WTO to provide certainty so that US agriculture can export in a consistent way to those countries around the globe. And so we can talk about what's wrong with the WTO, but we don't want the WTO to go anywhere. And I don't think we should forget the fact that it was the United States that really formed the foundation of a number of those rules. And last but not least, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. I am concerned that the way that we are using our trade agenda is frankly squandering the US's moral authority. If we consistently use as our policy the threat of tariffs and twisting the arms of our neighbors rather than working with them, one, those threats become empty if we don't follow through. But two, we are also sending the message, as was done just this past week with Mexico, where tariffs have now become the answer to solve our immigration problem, that US negotiations are never really done. We just concluded an update of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement where we agreed that we would remain a tariff-free environment between the US, Canada, and Mexico. And before that ink is dry, before our legislatures have had a chance to vote, here we are again threatening tariffs, calling them an entirely separate matter. What that means, again, is that really the terms apply to others, but not to us, and that we can unilaterally change them at any time. So we are undermining the value of what it means to be a free trade agreement partner with the United States by threatening those tariffs. And you can bet that China, Japan, the EU, and other countries are watching all of this and wondering what that value is as well. And we need, again, those partnerships to move forward. So with those thoughts, I will now turn it over to all of you for questions.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists. We had some, I think, great discussion there. Now it's your turn to engage in the conversation. So anybody in the audience who has questions, we have a couple microphones roaming around. For those roundtable members who have already downloaded the mobile app, you can submit questions on your phone as well. So any questions in the audience? Have one? Tom?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank all of the panelists, and including Dr. Chandler, for, I think, some very significant insights in the context that trade issues are challenges that we have as a result of a strong dollar, of existing trade policies, of a number of things that are confronting us in a way that we've not seen for some time. But I would also suggest that there's an elephant in the room that everybody is dancing around. And I believe the elephant in the room is 9 decades, or nearly 9 decades, of agricultural policy that's focused on commodities, in which every issue ultimately becomes addressing the commodity policies as they affect us in the short term and immediate. The FAPRI numbers suggest that in 2023, farm income will be, gross farm revenue would be $410 billion. If 15 cents goes to the farm gate, that suggests $2.75 trillion of global trade. That actual number is probably closer to 7.6 trillion. What I believe we need to be discussing, and I would appreciate the views of all of you, is when is the agricultural community going to begin to refocus its policy needs in a manner that supports what those of you on the podium, Mr. Chandler, are directly and indirectly suggesting, and that is that we need to immediately look for new policy opportunities that are more clearly focused on value-added efforts that substantially reduce our dependency on commodity markets that can be easily displaced. Thank you.
I don't know that it's the elephant in the room. If it is, it's been here for a while, and we haven't done very as well with it as our friends in Europe have. If you look at Europe's exports and look at our exports and look at what's value added and what's not value added, I'm not sure that anymore there's as much policy driven as it was years ago when the EU had the common ag policy as it is now. But it surely would help if our percentage of value-added exports would increase. And as you look down the road, maybe that has, there's an opportunity there. We think about 300 million new middle-class consumers in China. We can look at growth everywhere else that want to move up the consumption scale. We look at one particular situation now that's going on, the African swine fever. Are they going to import value-added, i.e. hogs that are already killed, versus the other? So I don't think it's a new elephant, but it may still be, but it's not a new elephant. And I think that if you look at changes in the world and in the U.S., there's maybe some opportunities to reduce the size of that elephant.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have an R&D system, especially the public R&D, research and development policies and funding for research. In a sense, we inherited a system where we wanted to achieve food security in the U.S., and it made sense to lower the cost of feed and grains and oilseeds to basically boost the caloric intake of U.S. consumers. And now we have done that. We have overreached our objective in a sense by over-consuming. And so what could be desirable is to have an R&D system that really refocus on healthier foods, fruits and vegetables, nuts and other things. And so in a sense that would call for redirecting resources that go towards commodity agriculture, towards non-ag R&D, and also the lags are very long. So you make massive investment in research and development, say in public universities or in partnership with private entities, and then 10, 15 years later, you can reap the rewards and see high-value products being more competitive. It's not exactly value-added, but typically those high-value products have better value-added opportunities than corn and soybeans.
Yeah, I think consumers are already taking us down that path, and that government is just slow to respond. I think we've been seeing for the past decade, really, the kind of decommodification or if that's a word, of our agricultural streams. And people don't necessarily buy soybeans anymore. They want non-GM soybeans or organic soybeans or high oleic soybeans or a particular protein content. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. The challenge is that the bottlenecks there are going to be an infrastructure that can handle identity preservation and segregation of those streams, apart from what we've built, which are huge facilities that assumed that a soybean was a soybean and you could commingle them all. So I think we're seeing those supply chains kind of pull themselves apart a bit to feed specific consumer demand. And I think you're seeing that not just in grains and oilseeds, you're looking at that in production techniques and particular qualities in protein, whether that's grass-fed beef or a plant-based meat substitute or a cell-cultured alternative. So I think the way we think about and relate to food really has to do more with marketing to specific consumers who are really looking at their food purchase not just as a source of calories, but a specific reflection of things that they value. Whether that's animal welfare or in a vegan diet, or if it's looking at palm oil sustainability, and they're going to shop that way. So how can government policy then create the infrastructure to make that possible, but also think about how we can return more of that food dollar and the value that's added all the way back down to the producer level? And I think that needs to be a priority going forward.
Luke, did you want a chance to answer that?
Sure. Is that on? Okay. Look, I think it's a really good point, and clearly, as some of my charts were showing, from a commodity perspective, it's really hard to compete with some of these lower cost producers and lower cost exporters, and so we've seen that reflected. And just recently, we had a conversation around the wheat situation in the world with some of our leadership group, and I was talking about the planting situation here in the US. It was a perfect snapshot of one of our US-based leaders was talking about farmers really struggling to make money at current prices in Kansas and Oklahoma, and then our person who sits in Europe chiming in and saying he had just been in Russia and Ukraine, and farmers there were really upbeat about current prices and current levels of profitability, and we're looking to expand further. So it clearly just goes that if you're only staying in the commodity spectrum, it's going to get increasingly tougher, which is why some of this is outside of a producer's control, such as the strength of the dollar, for example. So we clearly get that, and why things like technology and becoming low-cost producers or more efficient and driving productivity gains is really important. But clearly, as I fully agree with what some of the things Darci was saying around consumers are really going to help drive some of this change, and it's really going to be around which consumers can be, which producers can be most adaptive to those new demands of the consumer, and so supply chains are getting reshaped both here but also around the world. So who can adapt best to meet those demand needs is going to be really important. And then to the I think maybe some of the long-term policies around commodities restrict or reduce the flexibility, because they don't put the pressure around the need for change as urgently as it might be otherwise.
Thank you. I think we have a question back here and then up front. John?
Thank you, Megan. First of all, to this last discussion, a small piece that you might consider. The industry that I led and negotiated for saw a 60-fold increase in exports from 1985, pork exports. If you look at poultry and beef and other value-added products. The increase in soybeans seems small, although it matters a lot. So there were products where we did things. The question that I want to pose follows the logical, to me, but maybe not to you, consequences of what Darci laid out. One of the real conundrums we have is that there is broad political support for the actions our president is taking in much of rural America. If you follow the logic of the consequences and also economic history, we are likely to have something that approaches an agricultural depression as a result of all of the things that fall apart in the global trading system. We already know what that looks like. We know what it was in the 30s and before. So my question is, first of all, is it really that logical that it follows? And if it is, what can we do about this? Or should we?
So we're asking you all to question farmers' logic here. Who wants to take that first?
Well,
Can I just maybe relay a little bit of a conversation I had with a farmer in the spring of 2017. So I had just left the Obama administration, was attending a big agricultural meeting, and I talked to a farmer who had participated in, been a leader in one of the commodity groups. And, you know, in the fall of 2016, when, you know, the sand was running out of the hourglass, but we still had a glimmer of a thought that we would try and push TPP through Congress, all of the ag groups would come into town and they'd do their fly-in, where they were going to meet with all their members of Congress. And inevitably, the president of the corn growers or the wheat guys or whatever would call me the day before and they would say, Darci, come into town tomorrow and we're ready to go. We're going to go see all the members of Congress and we're going to ask them for three things: TPP, immigration reform, and regulatory relief, in that order. And so when I saw this individual, I said, you know, why is it that you told me you wanted these three things in that order and you voted exactly the opposite order? Because, you know, President Trump said he was going to work on regulatory relief, but he was anti-TPP, and he was not saying what farmers needed to hear about immigration. And if I had to look at your bottom line and what you needed in terms of price stability and access to foreign markets and the ability to have ag workers to help you get your job done, those to me add more to your bottom line than regulatory relief. And he said, well, you might be right, but one, I didn't actually know he could pull out of TPP all by himself. Like, I didn't really think he could do that. I thought he needed Congress. And so I know he said he was gonna, but I didn't think he would. And what if, you know, what if Japan got cold feet? Like, there were all these other countries that had to do stuff. And so even though the negotiation was done, the process seemed opaque and it kind of seemed far off. And then, frankly, every president's been saying they were going to do immigration reform for as long as I can remember, and it's such a political hot potato that it just can't get done. But it was sort of tangible to me to think about regulatory reform and what that might mean for my everyday practice on the farm. So it just seemed more real. And what I took from that was shame on me. Shame on the trade community for continuing to speak in our special language about non-tariff barriers and all of the acronyms and the language and the stuff that we use, and not make it more real. Because if there's one thing that we could be doing right now to give farmers more certainty, it would be guaranteeing access to these markets and following through on the deals we already made. But if the average farmer, who again delivers their grain to an elevator or their hogs to a processing plant, they're not engaged personally in trade. If they can't connect the dots back to what's happening in those foreign markets, maybe we haven't all done our jobs in a way to make sure that the support is there for that trade agenda. And I've been thinking about that a lot since that conversation. And I certainly think that's one of the reasons why the ITER Institute and the Farm Foundation Trade Center are so important, is to help make very tangible what in fact a trade agenda means for U.S. agriculture and for the health of rural communities across the country.
Yeah, I think this administration has a portfolio of activities and policy changes. So when you look at the tax reform, that has been, I think, by most people views successful and quite an achievement. The Obama administration had put a lot of regulatory framework with executive orders that have been undone, and so that's also, I would say, in terms of bottom line, some achievement. And so you have, even though trade has been, in my view and the view of many people, a disaster, it's part of a larger portfolio of otherwise a positive development in terms of the bottom line of many people. And so I think that may also explain why many people have a positive view of their overall portfolio, even though trade is definitely hurting a lot of people. The other achievements may also, I think, explain why people see positively what's happening.
I'll pass. No, the one thing I said, just so John knows where we're from the start, the logic is there. Darci's logic is there. The question is, do we wise up enough to stop the direction the logic is taking us?
We got a question over here, and then one up here in the second row.
Thank you, and Darci, I appreciate your comments on the moral high ground. I guess the question is to you and the other panelists as well, but it wasn't all that many years ago when we saw the headlines of Chinese scientists digging up corn seeds out of the ground in the Midwest, and we talk about the huge trade imbalance that we have to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. And I struggle with that. I know a lot of other farmers do as well in terms of the broader impact to the next generation, to our small communities across the country, and what that technology theft and the trade imbalance in terms of the dollars really means. And so I guess my question to you is, do we sometimes, and this goes back to what you mentioned, connecting the dots for farmers and people in rural America, do we sometimes silo trade and trade policies in terms of looking at it as trade, not just as the broader picture, impact to rural communities as a whole, that the trade really is used as a weapon, and like what they're doing now with the tariffs targeting the places that supported our current president, hitting them in the pocketbooks. Does that get lost, or do you think the spotlight shining on it is helping that? I know that's a very broad question, but it's tough for me because I see both sides of this. As a farmer that grows grains and nuts that are exported, and beef as well that gets shipped on boats and trucks out of our community, but yet I also see the other side of that, and I know a lot of other farmers do as well in this room and across the country. And so my question is, again, is the trade talk siloed too much in terms of just trade, and can we do a better job connecting it back to the farmers? But then if we do that, do we really have the tools in our tool chest to take on this trade surplus, to take on the technology theft or forced transfers, those kinds of big issues that really will have an impact on our future generations? Thank you.
So I guess what I was saying is that I think that we actually undermine our own effectiveness in taking on those larger questions of reform that get to the fundamental conditions in terms of trade, like not protecting intellectual property or stealing it or forcing its transfer, when we make this a US versus China issue, instead of making it a larger issue about following trade rules and the kind of behavior that we expect. So yes, I think right now we tend to kind of have trade over here and other issues over there, and sometimes we silo them, or we talk about TPP and trade deficits, but we don't talk about the fact that TPP was actually an effort to bring ourselves closer to the Asia Pacific. There were real political goals there in aligning ourselves with the region as well as the trade benefits. So I think we need to talk about them together. I guess what I'm saying in the China context is that by not bringing our allies into this conversation who also want to see reform, we are reducing the chances of actually getting reform, because the commitments China is making are just to us for a limited period of time. For those of you who may have been reading about what's on the table with the Chinese, my understanding is what we're negotiating is a 6-year agreement. You're not going to reform the Chinese economy in that amount of time. And a US-China agreement with a 6-year duration says we'll behave until this is over. Not we're going to change our practices to better respect intellectual property globally, which is what we need. And let's not forget that we don't just do business back and forth with China. Chinese parts and Chinese goods are in all the products that we import from other places. They're in products we make and export to other places. So if we don't have a global system that's helping to discipline China's behavior overall, that is a huge missed opportunity. And as the maps showed us earlier that Luke showed us, China can get a lot of the stuff we send them somewhere else. And they're going to make an effort to do that, to make a point, to make it hurt that we're trying to make this a battle instead of a larger push for reform for that the global community expects them to achieve. So I think we absolutely should be pushing for greater reform, for addressing the underlying issues that have made the trade relationship unfair. And it may in fact require some pain points to do that, but by doing it ourselves, I think whatever agreement we end up reaching will be less sustainable in the long run. And then will it have been worth it to put US Ag through what we're putting them through now?
I'll pass as well. So.
Let's go into another question.
Okay, we've got time for one more question right here in front.
So I just want to follow up too on that first question because I thought that was a really good one. And as a producer, interested in the decommoditization of markets, and we are trying to enter some markets that where the consumers actually, where the buyers actually care about what we're producing and care about quality. Kind of our experience is, for us, it's been worthwhile, but I think for the average producer, it's difficult. It takes a lot of extra work, and it takes a lot of extra expense to have the identity preservation and to develop those markets. And it's not a clear-cut, obvious choice to do that as the producer. And I think it has to be, to your point, it is consumer-led, it is industry-led. Government is lagging behind on that front, but I don't think that government can really lead that effort, because I think the consumers have to be willing to pay the extra expense, to pay the premium, I guess, to have the producers go to the extra effort, because it is extra effort. Now, the question that I want to ask is, before I came back to the family farm, right at a year ago, I spent the 5 years before that working for a large John Deere dealership, and my responsibility was exporting used equipment. And so we developed, I traveled lots of places, and we were developing markets where we could send the excess that we had. And Paraguay was one of our markets. We sent a lot to South America. And so I came back to the farm right at a year ago. Prices were good, things looked good. Everybody was saying, why would corn prices go down? It's just going to keep going up. And then about 3 weeks later, I think we had some tweets and this whole China thing started, the trade war, and soybean prices plummeted, and everybody knows what's happened over the past year. So, interestingly enough, though, some of the contacts that we had in Paraguay came up to visit our family farm about 3 weeks after I went back to the farm, and they're here looking for used soybean planters because they're expanding their acreage. And so really my question is, for the panel, what is the long-term detrimental impact to farming? So if Trump and Xi meet here in a couple of weeks and they say, yeah, we're going to have a deal, how good is that deal? To your point, how good is the deal? And, will we ever get 100% of the market back? Because I don't think we will. Because they've developed new relationships. Over the past year, they have developed relationships with other places in the world.
Yes. Supply chains take time to establish, as you point, and then if you disturb them, You're going to establish new, it's the same in manufacturing too. People look at Vietnam as other places to source elements compared to China. And I guess the same in agriculture. So you have those developing new trade relationship, and what has been lost may not come back. That's very likely, I think. So.
My answer is you lose it and you never get it all back in terms of that. And the longer it goes on, the more you're going to lose and the less you're going to get back. And I think we've reached a point right now, if you take a look at where we are and have been for the past 4, 5, 10 years, and look at where we will be, is we will become more of a residual supplier, and we will have a smaller share of the world market and a larger share of the world stock. We'll be the residual supplier. We'll be the stockholder and the residual supplier because of some of the changes we made. Mexico and corn, after what went on in NAFTA early on, we're going to pull the NAFTA agreement and so forth. Mexico started sourcing corn elsewhere. So dairy the same way. It affects everybody. So we will never get it all back. We didn't get it back from the commodity embargoes in the 1970s, and we won't get all of this back. And I'm afraid that's just the way it's going to be. Hopefully, the demand will pick up somewhere along the way here faster.
I think Dick said it all.
Well, unfortunately, we are over time this evening, so please join me in thanking our fantastic panel.